So what the talks are about is very specific. We don't really tend to talk about a whole lot of subjects just for the sake of them being interesting, let's say. But rather the talks are about happiness in daily living. And so whatever's spoken about is spoken about because it's directly relevant to that topic. And it's an important topic because, in my experience, after having started to seek something meaningful, and I was seeking a lot of different things in my head. Not the seeking wasn't always in my head, but the idea of what I was seeking was an idea in my head. And at different points in time, I thought I was seeking meaningful things, and it turns out that actually there was only one thing I was really after. And that one thing was happiness for Roger in this life. And happiness needs to be defined more specifically. Otherwise, if I just say happiness, then what will happen is you'll project your definition of happiness onto what I'm talking about, and it could be very different. And so happiness turns out to be something quite simple. It's not a feeling of excitement or joy or some other sort of pleasure, bliss or ecstasy. Turns out to be peace of mind in daily living. So when something happens, whatever happens is going to be pleasurable or painful. The flow of life, and the word flow of life really means moment after moment, circumstance after circumstance after circumstance. So walking from your bedroom to the bathroom is the flow of life. Getting into the shower is the flow of life. Turning on the water and finding only cold water comes out is part of the flow of life. And the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. And that pleasure or pain is determined based on how the situation and the biological preferences of the body interact. That determines whether it's pleasure in the moment or pain in the moment. So this peace of mind is peace of mind regardless of the circumstance. Meaning we find ourselves in the flow of life and circumstance. It is going to be painful from time to time. And it's a matter of how our attitude to the circumstance is. There's either an attitude of doership and attachment, and that attitude of doership and attachment tends to turn into, in practical terms, guilt or blame or pride in regard to the circumstance that is happening, or worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcomes. So attachment to outcomes is, really wanting pleasure and really resisting pain. I'm not talking on a biological level. The resisting of pain on a biological level, the moving of your hand away from the boiling hot water if it's boiling hot, that you could say is resisting the pain in the moment. Otherwise, the non-resisting would be keeping your hand under the boiling hot water, which is not going to happen biologically. We're designed to move away from pain. So the peace of mind is our attitude to the flow of life, attitude to the circumstance that's happening. And the attitude of doership and attachment tends to mean that the attitude to the flow of life is going to be guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome. And that attitude can extend for a long time after the event has happened. And what's significant is that these different forms of suffering, which are always attitudinal and not circumstantial, at their root, we could say, is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, or an uncomfortableness with life. But ultimately, when we really feel into it, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And what that uncomfortableness does is it pervades the experience, and it's what we can call suffering in life. So suffering, in the way it's being used here, isn't referring to unfortunate circumstance. It's not talking about getting your finger caught in the door, or finding yourself homeless and sleeping on the street and feeling cold, or finding that you are starving because you're in a country where there's no food. Now that's a very unfortunate circumstance, so I'm not diminishing the range of pleasure and pain that can exist in the flow of life. But what is being done here is creating a distinction between the flow of life, which is always pleasure and pain, and attitudinal suffering, which is never circumstantial, always our attitude to circumstance. And with this doership and attachment to outcome attitude, it will seem like my suffering is because of the circumstance. The attachment to outcome essentially means as soon as an outcome is not as we would like, and actually even when it is as we would like, there are different forms of uncomfortableness that pervade the situation even when we're getting the pleasures that we want. With that attitude in place, as soon as circumstance is there, meaning basically a lot of the time in our life there is this uncomfortableness that arises simultaneously, and unless we look very closely, we don't see that there is circumstance and attitude to it. So this is probably the most important distinction to be recognized. That my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, and my unhappiness is not a direct result of outcomes. So this statement, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, means that I won't find happiness in circumstance. What I'll find in circumstance is at best pleasure and at worst pain. And actually my unhappiness isn't to be found in circumstance. In circumstance, I'll find pleasure or pain. But if there's an attitude that is attached to circumstance, such that we believe that circumstance is what will complete me, then when the circumstance is painful, it will be received as an attack on who I believe myself to be. It's really an attack on the belief that says my completeness, my happiness is to be found in life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so with that attitude in place, there is this feeling that the circumstance is the problem, that what the other person has done is the problem, that what I have done is the problem. So I've just suggested that one of the biggest distinctions that needs to be recognized is the difference between circumstance, which is always pleasure or pain, and the attitude to circumstance. Another distinction is one that I've just mentioned, the distinction between pleasure and pain, and the recognition that the flow of life, that circumstantially life is only ever pleasure or pain. If we start seeing this for ourselves, meaning you can just, first you can imagine any situation that you find yourself in. You are walking out the door and you stub your toe on the door jamb, and it's painful. Now that's part of circumstance, part of the flow of life, and it's pain in the moment. So pain in the moment and pleasure in the moment can be split into physical or sensational pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, and just for fun, we include financial pleasure and pain. It's not really just for fun, it's a significant factor in the way life is set up now. So if you go to book an airline ticket and you see it and it's $400, you think, oh, this is great, I'll book this in an hour or tomorrow. And then you go back tomorrow and it's $600. Then the circumstance is financial pain in the moment compared to the theoretical or the hypothetical that you booked it the day before. And so if we recognize this, what might happen is there will be a feeling of financial pain. So when I say feeling, it's got to do with our preferences of not spending, let's say, more money if we're in a situation where money is tight. And then the suffering, so that makes sense. It's part of the circumstance. So there's this pain in the moment, not my preference. If you log on and the airline ticket is now $200, that's financial pleasure in the moment. That's the biological reaction that happens in the moment. Pleasure or pain. And then the suffering is what can extend horizontally in time for a long time sometimes. And it's a story about what this means about me, what it means to me. And so emotional pleasure and pain is not suffering. Emotional pleasure and pain is the same thing. Someone yells at you and says, you're terrible. It's not my preference to get yelled at. It's not my preference to be told that I'm, not helpful, let's say. So it's going to be emotionally painful to hear that information. The suffering is whether I turn that into a story of being inadequate or blaming the other person and hating them for what they have told me. So the emotional pain makes sense. And similarly, if someone tells us that we've done a great job, we've helped them out, we're a fantastic friend, that feels nice to hear that. It's in line with our biological preferences to hear that. And if it gets turned into pride, then the pride is the attitude. If we start feeling superior, then that is the attitude to the pleasure or pain. The pleasure in the case of this example, of being told that you're a great friend. And so if you have good food, tastes nice, that's pleasure in the moment. If you see a great sunset, that's pleasure in the moment. Nice music, it's pleasure in the moment. If you watch a movie and it's in line with your preferences, pleasure in the moment. And obviously the flip side, pain in the moment. And so we tend to find that we go through life with the idea that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in outcomes. My completeness is to be found in the flow of life. And so if that belief is in place, we're going to find ourselves faced with life moment after moment, and that's going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. That's just the nature of the flow of life. We're not in control of it. We're not in control of what happens in nature. We're not in control of what happens in our body. We're not in control of what the other does. And frankly, we're not really that in control of what happens through us either. And so if we go around with a belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes, like essentially it's saying I'm incomplete unless life looks the way that I imagine I need it to look in order to be complete. So given that life is a mystery, moment after moment, it's going to unfold according to not my will. It's a pretty dangerous structure to have in place as far as our peace of mind goes. The ingrained belief that my completeness is to be found in life looking the way I want it to look. It's a recipe for disaster. And furthermore, we have this ingrained belief of personal doership. The belief that I am the doer of everything that I think, everything I feel, everything I say, all of my actions, based on how life is experienced. So the experience of life on the surface is, yes, I am a separate independent entity in control of everything I say, feel, and do. Let me finish the point of doership. And if we see ourselves this way as the doer and the other as the doer, when the other does something or when life flows through the other, and the result is pain to me or someone I love, then I will receive that pain as an attack on who I am. I'll feel diminished based on my imagination of myself that requires life to be pleasure. And I'll see that as an attack delivered by the other, and so I'll have to hate them because my image of them is the other as the doer, the other as a separate independent entity. You hurt me, so now I hate you. And if the action happens through me, I function a certain way, and the outcome is not in line with my expectations or someone else's expectations, that's pain in the moment. And on the same basis, pain in the moment, okay, who's responsible? Well, it was my action, so I'm the one that I need to blame. So that's guilt. And when things happen through me that are positive, then there's the propensity for pride. On the same basis, I'm the doer, look what I have achieved. So essentially, these ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. I'm the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness, my completeness is to be found out there, are the very basis of the identity that blossoms into suffering throughout the course of life. Now, these are all descriptions that I'm putting forward, just descriptions of dynamics or descriptions of what is from one perspective. Remember, all really relevant to the topic of happiness in daily living, because it turns out that what we're really looking for, what will satisfy us when it comes, is when we find ourselves continuously happy in life, and that happiness is peace of mind. So when we find ourselves continuously at peace with life, at peace with ourselves, essentially, then we say, oh, this is all I've ever wanted. I need nothing more than this. So all of these descriptions and dynamics are being shared because they're completely relevant to what we're really looking for. And just to round off before I take the question or comment, is what put these beliefs in place? What put the root or the basis on which suffering arises in place? The doer, the belief in personal doership that is ingrained in us by and large as a generalization, that belief will say, well, I guess, not I guess, it will say, I'm the doer, I did it, my bad. It turns out that the belief in personal doership, which is part of the problem, is actually an error. This is the good news. It means that all the suffering is an error. If the error is corrected, then the suffering automatically dissipates, because it no longer has a ground from which to stem. And so the answer to the question, who put this attitude that creates a resistance with life, a resistance and uncomfortableness with myself in place? The answer is, it's part of life. Life put it in place. We didn't do it. The beliefs are part of our makeup at any point in time, and our makeup on a biological and psychological level, which is the two aspects of the human being that are part of the flow of life. Our makeup on a biological and psychological level based on two factors, our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And those two factors are factors that we weren't in control of. We've never been in control of, and will never be in control of, my genetic makeup, which really refers to the complete body system. So the egg and the sperm come together, and that, let's say, is the, in very simplistic terms, the forming of the genetic code, and it grows. And we're a result of the growth. We don't control the growth. We're essentially after the growth, or the growth doesn't ever stop, really. We're continually growing on a biological level, and that growth is not independent from circumstance. And so the circumstance is the other factor. So circumstance, we can say, is new conditioning that affects the genetic structure, and so they're not really two. You can look at genes and up-to-date conditioning as we've separated them out conceptually, genes and up-to-date conditioning, or new conditioning in each moment that as a cumulative effect we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So the human being is this package of genes and up-to-date conditioning on a biological and psychological level. There's something else that hasn't been spoken about, the consciousness that functions through the body. What determines the movement of the person through life is the circumstance and how the instrument, or the human being, biologically reacts and psychologically reacts to the circumstance. So on this basis, we're forced to act one way, the way that we're shaped, and the circumstance, which we're not in control, is going to create a reaction or a response. I'm not talking about reaction in a sense that is, that's negative. Anything, if someone asks a question, there is a reaction, which is to answer the question or not answer the question. And how the question is answered is based on the question, which is part of the circumstance that I had no control over, and how that circumstance and the body, which is based on genes and its up-to-date conditioning, how that reacts to the circumstance. We could actually see that the circumstance and the instrument are not two. They exist codependently. But if we create this conceptual separation so that we can come to understand things in a way that we haven't seen before, Once they get seen, then we see, we can sort of allow the conceptual distinctions to fade away because we've got clarity about the important functioning of the body or of the person. So this means that no one's at fault. They didn't choose to be a particular way in any moment. It doesn't mean that outcomes aren't going to be painful or what we would call negative relative to certain benchmarks. So if someone, is making eggs for breakfast and they take the carton of eggs out and it falls on the floor because, what we would call they're being clumsy, let's say, it's a result of the circumstance and the person's biological makeup. So the outcome is not positive relative to the benchmark of having eggs for breakfast because they're now broken on the floor. But who's doing, and so what I mean by doership is this attitude to what has happened. So surely the body did the breaking of the eggs, let's say, even if it was an accident, right? It fell out of the body's hands. But was there the possibility, or was there someone that was in control of it being that way or the other way? And so the belief in doership is this attitude towards what happens, whereby there is this imaginary entity that is steering the bus. And when we look closely, we find actually there isn't an entity that has complete volition over what it does next. There isn't this imagined entity that is completely isolated from everything else and makes its own choices. There is a much more gross entity, which is the body and the mind, the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that is what makes decisions. That is what understands things. And it understands things or doesn't understand things based on its makeup. Genes and up-to-date conditioning.
One, two. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
You can go ahead. I think it's...
Yes. Yeah, okay, right. 2 questions. One question is a small one. The influences of conditioning. I think you like to distinguish 3 channels. One channel would be the body. Another channel would be emotion. And a third channel would be finance. That's what I understood. And I'm not so in sync with finance to be a third category, because for me it's a subset of emotion. Mm-hmm. It could be a subset of body, even and actually body and emotion is also not so easy to distinguish. Sometimes they are interlinked and dependent. So I would see only 2 channels, which would fit, by the way, nicely with your other terms when you say biological or psychological influences. So the question would be, where is there a need for this third category? This would be the first question.
So the physical, emotional, and financial distinction is brought in when we're talking about pleasure and pain. So we say that the pleasure and pain is either physical, emotional, or financial. So you could break it down into, I guess, another category, subcategories like employment pain, right? So anything that happens at work you put into the category of employment pain. But then if you look at the employment pain, it'll fit under these categories of physical, emotional, or financial. So let's say at work, you get told that your pay is being reduced. Then that's painful on some level. And which category do we put it into? If we didn't have financial as a category, then would it be physical or would it be emotional? And to me, it's like you could say it would be physical pain if that reduction of money ultimately is going to mean that, let's say, you can't keep your heaters on for as long as you normally do, because you don't have the money to pay for the bills. And emotional, if you stretch it a little bit, and well, see, this is why the category of financial pain is there, just so that we have. You could create more categories if you want. Or less, yeah. You could just call it pleasure and pain. Because ultimately, that's the only reason those distinctions are there, is so that the pleasure and pain and the flow of life can become more understood by us when we see it. And then whenever that happens after it's been clearly understood, whenever any pain happens, we recognize it as pleasure or pain. We don't need to categorize it. And even to categorize it as pleasure or pain, in the end, is not necessary. There is the pleasure or pain in the moment, as a sensation, or as a feeling, or as a thought. And really, all of this talk is trying to get our attention onto the level of experience, to see and ultimately to feel. To start feeling life and understanding what is being logical. So it's part of your biological preference.
So emotional pain does not belong.
Important, because the words, like, we have to pick words to put forward the concepts. And because they're very specific concepts, there aren't necessarily the perfect word. So if I say your biological preferences, someone might say, well, biological just means, your tissues and your body, and doesn't include anything to do with the brain or thinking. Because thinking is maybe automatically put into psychological.
At least that's the categorization we know from science.
Mm-hmm.
So to deviate from this category is something which needs to be
explained. Yeah. So this is why, if we break it down into psychological is my attitude to life. So that's why we introduced the notion of the working mind and the thinking mind. So the working mind is part of the biological makeup of the body. The working mind that can function in life and calculate things, can learn how to communicate efficiently, drive a car. All of that is, or a lot of that is thinking. So we'll say, what do I need to get from the shop today? So there's thought, but that isn't considered psychological thinking, but more biological thinking. That's part of the flow of life. And then the psychological is the attitude. So if we have that working mind and thinking mind, the working mind can continue to function, we can continue to have thoughts, and they don't disturb our peace of mind. They're not, by nature, something that will disturb our peace. The functioning of the thinking mind is by nature always something that will disturb our peace of mind. So the thinking mind produces the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. If we don't create that distinction, the working mind and the thinking mind, we might end up waiting for all thought to end. Because we've heard, let's say, that suffering is thinking, or thinking is the problem. And you have to have an empty mind or no mind. And so we might be practicing a meditation of no mind. And the fact is that when we're living life, thought is very much required to speak, to assess things out, when to call a taxi to get us to the airport, and all sorts of things require thinking. Now that thinking doesn't have to stop. That thinking won't stop. That thinking isn't a problem, and it fits into the category of our biological functioning. And so emotional pain, where it becomes tricky is most people, with this attachment to outcomes, whenever there's pain, suffering is there as well. And so when we talk about emotional pain, people are very familiar with emotional pain, but what they really are familiar with when we think about emotional pain is also the suffering that arises with it. And so when we talk about emotional pain, which is very different to physical pain. So if you bang your foot and it's painful, and then there is suffering, you've got the suffering is attitudinal. It's a form of thinking, but the pain is not a form of thinking. Emotional pain is much closer to the suffering. It's not physical, it's emotional. And so then that distinction between the emotional pain and the suffering can be harder to see, but they're actually two very different things. So someone let's say someone that I love, if they die, we could say that that's emotional pain. And we're very used to feeling emotional pain, and then the suffering arises with it because it has a story about what that emotional pain means about me. We feel like something that part of me has been lost, if there is this attachment.
But since we already have the category of suffering, I'm not so sure if we need the psychology, because the psychology seems to point in the same direction, which is this attitudinal.
Exactly, they're interchangeable words. They're synonymous with each other.
Okay.
So, a psychological reaction. If I can say we'll have a biological reaction in the moment, and then a psychological reaction if the doership is
suffering.
It's the same thing as suffering. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then it became more clear. If I may, then the second question.
Yes, and let's also be clear that if there's no suffering or no psychological reaction, because the thinking mind has dissolved, doesn't mean we won't still experience emotional pain. Yeah, but it will be seen as part of the flow of life, part of the biological movement, given the circumstance, and we'll find that emotional pain can be there, and yet we don't feel attacked on a level of self. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The second question is maybe a little bit trickier. How is, just to get it right, how was the sentence, the combination between happiness and pleasure? So you say...
your happiness will never be found in the flow of life.
Your happiness will never be found in pleasure or...
In pleasure or pain, yeah.
Yeah.
So the flow of life equates to either pleasure or pain. So your happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain, meaning don't look for it there.
Okay, so if it's not found, it sounds like it's completely independent. So I just create scenarios. There's a person and there is no pleasure at all. There is only biological pain, which in your terms includes body pain and emotional pain.
Yes.
The whole day,
Mhm.
10 years.
Mhm.
We would consider if the person is trained enough, if the person has the black belt in waking up or
Mhm.
whatever, then this person would be still happy.
On the definition of what happiness in this context, yes, happiness and that pain you're speaking about are completely they're on different levels.
Right. So independent. So this we could consider this person to be happy.
Yes, assuming the attachment and assuming that the mistakes that cause suffering to be there have dissolved, then they would be happy even with very unfortunate circumstance.
Right. So let's label this person, this imaginary 10 years only pain,
Mhm.
happy. Label
Yep.
happy. Second person has not only pain, but a lot of pleasure. 10
Mhm.
years, a lot of pleasure.
Mhm.
And this person also has the black belt
Mhm.
in waking up. So both actually we would consider to be happy.
Mhm.
Still, I would think the second version is somehow more attractive. Maybe I should not say this here, but I would
I'd take
prefer the second version.
So would I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but actually, but this comes to the point I would like to make. So actually, there's a reason why we would prefer the second version.
Mhm.
It's somehow nicer. Although both are happy,
Yeah.
the pleasure life would be more attractive.
Yeah, sure. The happiness wouldn't be better,
Yeah.
but the content on a flow of life level would be pleasure instead of pain.
Right.
Right. So our biological preferences are always for pleasure and not for pain. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why it's more attractive, because we have biological preferences that prefer pleasure. So the attitude of that allows happiness to be there is the attitude that understands that I have preferences, and yet life isn't necessarily going to deliver those preferences. Clearly, some people have chronic pain in life. Their preference would be to not be in pain, and life doesn't deliver that. The attitude, if it understands this, and if so what we haven't really spoken about yet is where the saving grace is. Why is my happiness not to be found in pleasure or pain? It's because of the core of what the human being is. It's the core of the person. And the core of the person, we could say, is something very unique. Or maybe it's not unique. It just happens to be what people are. What is at the core of everyone, not just the person who has found themselves happy. The core of the person, we could say, is consciousness. And this consciousness is already complete. It's never actually been incomplete. What covers up the completeness is the thinking from the thinking mind that gets put in place when life delivers certain conditioning from a young age. Certain conditioning are delivered, and an identity is formed. And that identity, based with beliefs at its core, starts producing a story about not being complete. Starts interpreting circumstance as proof that it is unworthy or not complete. And so that interpretation of circumstance is part of the new conditioning that forms this identity that then believes that it's something different to what it really is. So a bit like the what is it, the beggar that thinks they're a king, or the king that thinks they're a beggar. You are one thing, but if you have a belief that you're something else, that belief will obscure what you really are. Go back to the question, if you like.
Yeah, so actually I think my direction was that if we say happiness cannot be found in pleasure, then it's somehow, and all we're looking for is happiness in daily living.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like pleasure doesn't count. And this could be a conclusion. We meet here for one reason. You start always with it's very specific, and the specification is happiness in daily living. And we say this happiness guy is not found in pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And this could imply pleasure doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm relieved somehow that we both are on the same track. We would prefer the second version with more pleasure.
Yes.
So in a way, pleasure matters.
Yeah. So when we reconstruct everything, so once we've looked at life on its in detail, because let's say the concepts have brought attention to certain aspects of life. In a way, when we're looking at them, we separate it conceptually. But really, life is just what it is. So when we put it back together, we find that the whole life experience very much includes pleasure or pain in it. And very clearly, pleasure is nicer than pain. But what is being pointed at is that regardless of whether there is pleasure or pain, you can still be happy. So at the end, what you end up with is life on the attitudinal and the biological level. So the biological level is the pleasure and pain, and the attitudinal is the peace or the suffering. But there aren't really two levels. There's just life. So you either have a happy life or an unhappy life. And what we find is if you have a happy life, you might find that you have a happy life and it's pleasure sometimes and pain at others. Usually, it's never all one or all the other. It's a mix, pleasure and pain. And it could be that I have a happy life but with a lot of pain. A happy life with a lot of pleasure. So in the end, what we see is, well, we just have life and it's all there. Pleasure, pain, suffering and peace. They're all part of it. The suffering can dissolve. And what's important to see is that the happiness isn't dependent on the pleasure, which we can start to find experientially. If the attachment to outcomes falls away, we start to see, even when life is painful, even when I get told I've lost my job, the reaction on a biological level is, what? Wow. Not what I would like. And then our attitude is something completely different. The attitude is something that happens, once again, based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, so we don't control our attitude. It functions one way or the other. And why can the attitude of attachment to outcomes fall away? It falls away when we've been told, or some process has happened that redirects us inward, where we rest in what we can call the core of the human being, rest in our being, and we find that being is always there. And if we drop into it when circumstance is painful, and let's say when the suffering has started and we start blaming the other, my boss, doesn't he know that I put in 70-hour weeks? And here I am, as soon as the situation turns, he fires me. And so that's painful. And then there's suffering on top. That narrative I just mentioned is the suffering. And then if there's a remembrance, I am, and we drop into our being, effectively the thinking mind just gets the way he's designed to function. That mentation that is just sort of telling us that we're okay. It's a dropping into our okayness, like first-hand experiential. If I say, here I am, it makes it sound like I drop into a thought that says, oh, it's okay, you still exist. It'll be okay. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not some sort of justification or anything. It's just drop into. So now I'll say it without I'll do it without the words. Damn it, that. And then the thinking might kick in, and the feeling might kick in, and that covers up that being, and it will carry on for as long as it carries on according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if that attachment to outcome is still in place, it'll kick in, and then maybe the thought, if there is a part of our up-to-date conditioning that knows my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, awareness lands on the story about what this means to me and why it shouldn't have happened, and we see this is all outcomes, this is all circumstance, and my happiness isn't to be found there. I exist prior to circumstance, or I'm complete regardless of circumstance. And so that thought can cut off the story, and we drop back into being. And in this place of being, it's not about we drop into being and we become dysfunctional. We can drop into being and pick up the phone and ring up, one of the competitors and say, hey, I'm now free to come and join your team, while resting in being. And they might say, no, we're not hiring. That doesn't mean that we necessarily lose this connection to being. We can say, okay, well, I've done what I can for now, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Yes.
So, when you say to not be attached to outcomes,
No, I didn't.
it's
what
one of the 5 elements.
That's
right?
what the doer hears, right? The belief in personal doership hears a description, right? And it turns descriptions into prescriptions. Right? It hears, oh, well, this is what I have to do. This is my job. And it hears, Roger told me that suffering is not very nice compared to peace. So Roger is telling me I should have peace and not suffering. And he's telling me that peace will be there when the belief in attachment to outcomes falls away. So I have to not be attached to outcomes. That's all the doer belief inside of us, taking life a particular way, taking life as doership, which is completely normal, right? This is what it does. It's like it can't be there and not do that. So there's an opportunity here to see, wow, what I heard is I have to not be attached to outcomes. And it's like, I have to function, I have to, if I'm attached to outcomes, I'm failing. Not at all what this talks about. This talks describing dynamics.
So, how to not be attached?
Yeah, that too is a question coming from the doer, right? So how do I do it? Right? What this is saying is that life is a happening. Right? It's a story that has been created to unfold exactly the way it unfolds. And we are part of the story. So we can't do anything. And then someone says, well, why am I here if I can't do anything? You're here not because you, as the doer, decided to be here, but because life created a series of events that funneled you to be here based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, right? So you made choices, and we're used to seeing choices as my doing, but really they're a reaction of the body-mind organism in a particular situation. So Vikram says, Roger's coming to Pune, right? That's circumstance. And then the genes and up-to-date conditioning respond to that circumstance. And that response might be, oh, I wonder, I might book tickets and go to Pune. And then if the tickets get booked, that's a continuation of that happening. And so life is always happening.
Yeah, but then I really don't see how to go about your entire life not being attached to anything. Like, materialistic attachments has been that easy to let go of it, but then when it comes to being attached to a person, and then so let's say for years the friend was always there, but then all of a sudden there is a glitch. It's just not there anymore. And all these years when it was there, you took it for granted. Like, it's it's just there by default. It's never going away from me. And when you see it going away, just drifting away, I don't see how to not be attached.
Mm-hmm.
The other people, it especially happens to me, other people, they go on with the normal life, happily, normally. But then I get left behind, hurt, being attached to the outcome, how it used to be previously.
Mm-hmm. So what you describe is very understandable, and I actually don't think it's as uncommon as you might describe. I think it's something that is very common in life. This attachment to outcomes is something that's deeply ingrained in the human being. And so, once again, it's not asking you to detach from outcomes. So you've said that in your life you found that the falling away of attachment to material outcomes has happened. Right? Not so difficult. But not so difficult not because you did it, but because life brought about change such that it became clear that material outcomes are not something that complete who I am. That's why the attachment fell away. If you still believed that material outcomes were significant in completing you, in making you happy, you wouldn't be unattached to them. So the fact that the attachment has fallen away means life has taken away the belief that my happiness is to be found in material outcomes. So what you describe is that the attachment to love, right, is still very much there. So we can conclude now that there is a deeply ingrained belief that without love, I'm incomplete. You might not see it. It might not be a belief that you have consciously. But the fact that the uncomfortableness arises tells us that this belief is there. So I can't see your belief systems, but I can see the manifestations of them. Right? You shared them. So I can deduct that there is a deeply ingrained belief that my completeness is dependent on love from the other.
So what you go about your entire life being alone?
No, it's once again not a suggestion of what our life needs to look like. Right? Life will unfold and look like it's going to unfold and look like. So the question could be, so if I'm not the doer and I don't control this, well, what's the point of being here? And the answer is life has put you here. You didn't come here as the doer, but life brought you here. And just like life put you in all of the situations that you've been in, and in each of those situations, life is delivering new conditioning. And so the deeply ingrained belief that my completeness is dependent on love from the other was put in place by life, by a certain circumstance and certain reactions to the circumstance. That's what ingrained the attachment to love. And in the same way, life can undo these things by putting you in circumstance that delivers new conditioning that undoes the existing up-to-date conditioning. So you can be sitting there feeling very sad. Right? That makes sense. And yet life, you could even be sitting there feeling very helpless or desperate that you can't affect the change. And yet life, while this is happening, while you're feeling that way, is potentially, or is making change, right? Is delivering new conditioning. Life is always making change, always delivering new conditioning. This conditioning is radically different from the conditioning that you tend to receive out on the streets. So it makes sense that life is bringing about change through new conditioning, and when we look at it, we say, well, what more could I ask for in terms of new conditioning if I want change on a level of these attitudes of doership and attachment to outcomes, which is where the uncomfortableness stems from? What more could I ask for than life to put me in a position where new conditioning is being delivered? So you don't need to worry about the fact you're not the doer. You can relax as much as you're capable of. Right? Relax, especially if it clicks. It says, so I can relax and life is still doing the job that needs to be done. The relaxing is an attitudinal relaxing to whatever extent you can, and you'll still have to experience life, whatever that happens to be. It's somewhere in the system. Maybe there's a relaxing of what you need to achieve, or what you're not achieving, what you're failing at achieving. And that's not something that you have to do. That relaxing is a happening that will or won't happen depending on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what's the key point that I'm sort of hammering home is that you and I aren't the ones that bring about the change. So if you're trying to bring about change because life is uncomfortable, right? What does the part of the working mind, because I'm speaking to the working mind, what does the working mind conclude about your efforts to control life? Based on what I've been saying, if it sees the thinking mind trying to control life, what can the working mind conclude?
You asking me?
One word would be good. That the working mind tells the thinking mind.
To stop.
Yeah. And the working mind, why would the working mind tell the thinking mind stop? Hopefully it says it out of a recognition, an understanding that's not how things change for the better. That's how the suffering is perpetuated. And that is suffering. The I need to change this. This is unacceptable. I'm the one that is failing at changing this. That's the thinking mind. And if the working mind recognizes that life is doing everything, life has done the putting the dynamic that suffers in place, right? So the working mind will go, if I'm suffering, it's because I'm destined to suffer based on what life has put in place, right? Not my doing. So chill, chill as much as possible. This is if the working mind has been conditioned a certain way. So the working mind can think, it does think, based on its up-to-date conditioning. So if it's been conditioned a certain way, the thinking mind will be off doing its thing, and the working mind will be seeing things very differently. And the working mind, in essence, is it's trying to stop, but not as a doing. It's just a thought that arises that says, this thinking is not helping. This thinking is the suffering. And that working mind, recognizing the dynamic of the thinking mind, can bring the thinking mind to a stop, or the thinking mind will just keep going because it's got that momentum behind it. And we don't know what the outcome, which of those two things will happen. And we're not the ones controlling the working mind or the thinking mind. It's a functioning happening. But the good news is that below all of that, you're untouched.
Yeah, I always try to abide in I am, but then I find myself...
Can you use the...
I find myself forcing that I am, just let go of it, I am, but then...
So who's doing that?
The doer.
The doer, the thinking mind says, oh, okay, I'm suffering, so I need to abide in I am, right? The abiding in I am is the falling away of the doer, falling away of the thinking mind, and the falling away of the working mind. The working mind has seen this isn't helping, right? And it can be understand that if the thinking mind is too strong, no matter what the working mind then starts to insist. The mind sees it. More suffering on top of suffering. The insistence that I should abide in I am, and it's not working, and why is it not working? And trying is more mind. So it sounds like, so what do I do then? That's the thinking mind again. Where this starts to work is when the concepts that are being put forward really become understood intellectually. Right? And that means in the working mind. So they become understood intellectually, and then without us doing anything, the working mind just starts to function on its own. Just like the thinking mind is functioning on its own based on its conditioning. The working mind starts to see, wow, that's suffering in the form of blame. And it sees at the bottom of that did as the doer. And so it goes, wow, there's blame, and yes, the blame is based on the belief in doership. And it's blaming the other for what they did, which is circumstance and at worst pain in the moment. So the working mind goes, wow, there is a story that blames the other for what they did, which is deliver pain to me, thinking that that pain is actually an attack on who I am. So when this starts being seen, when the movements inside us, so it's not we're not saying stop it, right? It's about just coming to see the inner landscape in a way that hadn't been seen before, to understand it. That's already significant change happening. The seeing it, and in time, that understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. It really understands that whatever is happening through me is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. It might see that there is no one here doing anything. There's just life happening. As that goes deeper and deeper, meaning it gets ticked off, that reaction that happened through me, the suffering, I didn't decide to start suffering. A situation happened and then suffering happened. So it's seen more and more. It means the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. As the understanding is going deeper and deeper, it is uprooting the misunderstanding. If this understanding doesn't start going deeper and deeper, the ingrained misunderstanding remains untouched, and every time it functions, it's getting stronger. Whereas with the understanding, it starts getting witnessed and seen for what it is. And so then it doesn't tend to build on itself. And furthermore, it starts to get undermined.
Namaste, sir. Sir, in the case of someone who has had traumatic experiences in his life in the past, you recommended that apart from non-dual teachings, therapy is compulsory. So, what I want to ask...
I definitely didn't say it's compulsory. I said there could be a lot of other modalities or methodologies that can be helpful.
Yes.
And that non-dual teachings may not be the ideal answer to everyone.
Yes. Okay, sir. So what I want to ask is, what can be the estimation of potency of willpower of a family member of this person who has had traumatic experiences in his past? So yes, to bring normalcy into the life of that person who has had traumatic experiences in the past.
It could be helpful or it could be damaging. So if a family member has a strong willpower to help, that's what you're asking, right? It can actually be that willpower may well be a misunderstanding of life. It may be the misunderstanding that I can control life, that I can, through my willpower, help my family member. So the intention is great, but it could actually be something that is the very opposite of surrender. So at some point, let's say with understanding, we want to help people, but with the understanding that everyone is a product of life, and our input is simply part of life affecting that person in this moment. And we don't know whether the input we have is going to be enough or even appropriate to change what is in place. So at some point, we might realize that what we're doing with the best of intention is actually damaging, because it can make the other person feel inadequate. That people want to change them, even if it's for their best. So the understanding that we're not in control of life, that life is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, means that we will do whatever we can in each moment to help, but understand that the outcome is not in our control, not in the other's control, and hopefully understand that what I'm doing out of my best intention, because I want to help, may actually be not helpful.
And may be helpful as well.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, sir.
Could you deliver some new conditioning on dropping into being?
Dropping into being. Okay, so exactly that's what it will be, new conditioning, not an instruction, not a prescription. It will be a description of what might happen after life has delivered certain new conditioning. And so even this description is new conditioning, and a lot of what I've spoken about before is the new conditioning. So when we are walking through life meaning doing our daily life, living our daily life, if attention or awareness and the working mind lands on the functioning of the thinking mind, means recognizing that the thinking mind is functioning in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation, meaning a story, a mental story, a feeling of doership, even if it's this obsessive thinking about how my business needs to look or my career development or whatever that we might continually be thinking about. That's a form of expectation, thinking that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, or if it's blame or guilt. So when awareness lands on this, the seeing it, wow, that's suffering. And then all of the understanding in the working mind that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, that I'm not the doer, that the other isn't the doer, that suffering arises as a happening and it's not as useful as we think it is. It actually disturbs our peace of mind. Right? It doesn't solve problems, it creates its own new problems, this thinking being there. So all of that understanding is in the working mind. So when awareness and the working mind lands on the fact that suffering is happening, the thought, one of several thoughts, whichever happens to be part of your up-to-date conditioning, might arise. The thought, I am, could arise. Or the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, could arise. Or the thought, I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, might arise. And contained in that thought is all of the wisdom that the working mind has come to see. Right? Now, these concepts that are being delivered are there not so that we just memorize them. They're there so that attention lands on the experience of life. Right? So we come to feel and see, not just see with our eyes, but see by feeling the pleasure and pain in life, the fact that pleasure and pain is not an attack on who I am, if the thinking mind doesn't. So all of this, as it's seen as we go through life, becomes part of the wisdom that's in the body. And that wisdom tends to get covered over. We forget, even if there's that wisdom in the body, we forget because the old beliefs are still in the body. So that's why the thinking mind can carry on at the same time as this wisdom being in the body. And so when awareness and the working mind land on the fact that this obsessive thinking is happening, this suffering, the thought, I am, might arise, or my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, or whatever thought automatically arises. And that thought, I was conditioned by the teachings of Nisargadatta Maharaj to abide in I am. And I think in my interpretation of what was there, it was the thought I am will arise and cut off the suffering. And that is how I am to abide in I am. So abiding in I am is not abiding in the thought I am. Abiding in I am is resting in the core of our being. And the thought I am was just the trigger that reminded me that the suffering is actually my forgetting of myself. And the thought I am cuts it off, was a bookend to that thinking. And what came next was a dropping into being. And it's easier to drop into being if we understand that there is this place of being that is prior to thinking, meaning outside of the stream of thought. And so if we try to find this place of being in thought, it doesn't work. But once that understanding of how to flick the switch, because often we're trying to rest in being by pushing on a door that is meant to be pulled. And so if you're pushing on a door that is meant to be pulled, you can push as hard as you like and the door isn't going to open. Right? And if you just realize, oh, I'm meant to pull this door, and you pull the door and it opens. This happened to a friend of mine once. We went out drinking, and it was a tequila night. And so we were having tequila shots. And we'd had quite a few before we went out, and we sort of overdid it a little bit. And he was staying at my place with a couple of other friends. And so he came up and said, I've got to go. Can I have the key to the house? And so I gave him the key. And about 3 or 4 hours later, I don't know, it was 3 o'clock, I came home and I found him slumped against the gate, because to get into the house, there was a complex. There was a gate that you had to open. And I what's going on? And he woke up. He goes, the keys, the gate won't open. And so I put the key in and I pulled the gate, and he goes, oh. So he was drunk, and he'd spent half an hour trying to push the gate in the wrong direction. And so this dropping into being, if we try to find this place of being in our mind, in thinking, we'll spend a lifetime trying to be by thinking ourselves into being. Dropping into being is understanding there is this, it's just such a simple flip in the other direction. But it's, so once it happens, once we know that, oh, that's where it's to be found. I was doing the complete wrong action, trying to find it somewhere else, and all I have to do is just flick the switch, just touch it this way. It's a switch that goes this way, not that way. Pushing it this way, it's not moving. So all of this to say that, first, if we're going to abide in I am, first, the very first part is to find where this I am space is, outside of thinking, right? And then what I'm sharing here is the methodology that after we understand that there's this place of being, and we've sort of the pathway to it has become well trodden, and it's easy for us to drop in, then this is how to keep abiding there. because we keep getting dragged out of it, right? So there's two parts to it. One is to understand that if I'm continually judging and labeling everything and trying to get into being by thinking my way into being, we won't find the core of who we are in that space. So that's the first part, and there's various teachings that do that very well, pointing us to find the shift between thinking and being. And once it becomes clear that the thinking can just stop, that's being, is it? The thinking's happening, it's stop. The stop is it's like stop, rather than, this is the other one, the thinking is happening, and then we say, okay, now stop, you need to stop. Why aren't you stopping? That's not stop. You see, two different directions. So, once that's clear, then this abide in I am means that the old thinking tends to have a strong momentum going, and so we keep forgetting that I am. So every time awareness in the working mind lands on the fact that the thinking mind is functioning, the thought I am comes up, cuts off the thinking mind, and we drop into being. And the truth is that at first we might drop into being and we'll be able to stay there for about 0.5 of a second. And we'll get dragged out back into the thinking mind without even realizing we've been dragged out. And 15 minutes later, or 5 hours later, we'll realize, oh, there it is. It's been. When did I come out of being? Like, actually, and really, it would have been maybe resting in being for half a second. So, if you drop into being for half a second, and you get dragged out, and thinking happens for 10 minutes, and then awareness and the working mind land on the thinking again, the thought, I am, can pop out and we drop into being again for another half a second and get dragged out. And so the fact we're getting dragged out is not really a problem at this stage. What's important is that we are now remembering, oh, I am. And I am just means out of thinking and being. And it's a great little exercise because you don't have to sit. It's actually not something that you sit down and you do this exercise. This is an exercise that happens while you're working or walking in the street, and awareness lands on the thinking mind, and the thought I am happens and cuts off the thinking and drop into being. And so if it happens 10 times in the day and we rest there for half a second each time, that's fine. What's happening is we're strengthening that movement inwards into being. And then after day 3, we might find we get to rest in being for a second instead of half a second. And if this keeps happening, we might actually go 5 days where we forget about even the thought I am. And then on day 6, we go, wow, I forgot about it for the last 5 days. That's okay. So then that's when you start again. And it's not even you starting, it's not really a practice, it's just automatically awareness and the working mind land on the thinking mind, and the thought, I am. I am really means, this is all nonsense, I can cut it off right now, stop. But what about stop? But I won't get anywhere by not thinking, stop. But stop. And at some point, we find that the momentum shifts where we spend most of our time here instead of in the thinking mind. And it's actually our home. That the heart is the home of our being. And we've just been dragged out of it we've been away from home because of the deeply ingrained beliefs. And that's not where we reside. So in time we might find, this is easy. It's not even an effort. I don't need to keep coming back here. I am grounded here. And then we can walk through life still functioning, connected to being. And the connected to being could be the heart, you could say, is the junction point where impersonal consciousness of source links to the body-mind organism, the biological instrument that consciousness functions through. And so that's the joining place of the impersonal consciousness. And on one side, it's impersonal, and on the other side, it's the personal consciousness, what we experience through this body. So personal consciousness doesn't mean the suffering. Suffering is a component of personal consciousness when certain beliefs are in place. But personal consciousness is still what will be there when the suffering falls away. The personal consciousness is the experience of being Roger, living this life, and it is personal consciousness that contains suffering or doesn't contain suffering. So peace of mind turns out to be just the absence of suffering, not the dissolution of the person. The personality is still here, the body is still here, the functioning as the person in a world is still here. So often when someone has various realizations and shifts in consciousness, what falls away is the belief in doership, the belief that there is a separate, independent, autonomous entity. And when that falls away, we go around saying there is no person. I've seen there never was a person. What we're really saying is there never was a doer. And that insistence that everything is one, which does get seen, can obscure the fact that, everything's one, but there's a very particular sense in this manifestation, and that is that I live life as this person from this perspective. And so this doesn't mean that if I say that I am Roger, it doesn't mean that any realizations of oneness are now suddenly obliterated because you've blasphemed, you've said you are Roger. You can't say that. As soon as you say that, it means you see yourself as separate and you see everything as separate. That's how the old thinking used to function, because it had a definition of what Roger is as a separate, independent entity, the doer. And so when in the old definition we said Roger, and it meant separate, independent entity in a world of separation. But if that falls away and we see, Roger is part of life, everyone is part of life, and there is no doer doing anything, it's life happening. So that's seen, that's realized, there's a relief, there's a, wow, what a relief, I don't have to struggle. Life is living me, life is living everyone. And then we can come back and say, and I'm being lived and experiencing life as Roger, and to say that Roger is a concept, right, which is what tends to, when this awakening happens, it can be seen from the perspective that everything is a concept in the mind of God. Everything is a concept. Concept really means a thought. So when, from a big picture point of view, it's like the couch is a thought in the mind of God. Like a night dream is all an imagination or a thought in the mind of the dreamer. And so often we hear that the couch is a concept, and all sorts of, so this word concept gets used in many different contexts. And so when someone says Roger is a concept, they're looking at life from a certain perspective as being a creation, an imagination, and so the couch is a concept in the mind of God. And yet if it is all a concept in the mind of God, an imagination in the mind of God, it's an imagination that is designed for us to live it as if we are a particular character. So once the realization that I'm not the doer has happened, we can still come back and say, oh, I'm Roger, connected to Source. Roger, part of the manifestation, not separate from it. Or Roger, through which the one consciousness is functioning as personal consciousness. The body, the impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body, functioning through it as personal consciousness, and so I'm always connected to Source, not separate. And I can still say I'm Roger, not separate from Source. So this abide in I am means abide in the heart, which is the junction point between Source, impersonal consciousness, and personal consciousness. That's where we get to know the core of the human being, the core that is untouched by circumstance, the core that actually is self-confirming, self-contented, and at peace.
I have a couple questions, and also happy birthday to Vilda. So I'm going to start with my initial question, which is, Roger, can you talk about like what is intuition and déjà vu? And also, can you describe our perception of energy? Meaning, like, if you walk into a room and it feels substantially like it's dark or light, and there may not be even anyone in there, or there might be someone in there, or when you come across a person, and we'll use words in like the New Age movement, like the vibration is low, or the frequency isn't high, or something bad happened here and you can feel it, quote, bad. So I guess that's my question, is like, how do we perceive energy? And the impact can be real, quite real. And then also, what is intuition and an experience of déjà vu?
Okay. So energy is effectively, well, we're all energetic beings. When we look at it, that even the couch is energetic. So you could exchange energy for consciousness. Everything arises in consciousness, is made of consciousness, recognized by consciousness, or everything is energy. And the energy, so on the conscious, if we say everything is made of consciousness, which really is implying that this is all a creation inside the consciousness of a source, then there's no real differentiation on that level. On the level of energy, if we come down and say energy, you can see that energy vibrates at different frequencies, and energy vibrating at different frequencies manifests in different form. And so I think it's acceptable for us to say that the human being, which is in large part, or we could say the combination of the biological and the consciousness, the awareness in the being, let's say. So the human being is an energetic entity. And so we're going to feel energy, whether we know it or not. Depends on how finely tuned, I suppose, the body is. And being too finely tuned could be a curse, let's say, if you feel energy that other people don't feel. So really, I guess what I'm getting at is that there is an interaction of different energy frequencies in life everywhere. And so that, to me, is just circumstance.
But if energy impacts you, I mean, in Indian culture, they'll say not to, they won't shake hands because that's an energy exchange, or they'll say never wear another person's shoes because it carries the energy. But like if you're walking into a hotel room and it's like, whoa, the energy is super dark in here, like I feel uncomfortable.
Yep.
You know, like what is that? And is that something we should respond to, or is it something we should just embrace?
It's like getting caught out in a really heavy storm. It's circumstance. It's pleasurable or painful. And then our attitude to that circumstance is, or that pleasure or pain, is going to determine how we engage in it.
Intuition and déjà vu?
Intuition, you could, the way I say it is, it's a faculty of the body, a faculty of the intelligence of the body. So you can have, let's say, analytical thinking, which is a great faculty of the body. It's a tool. It's not the enemy, like most people think it's the enemy, when it actually, the thinking, the logical thinking is never the enemy. It's just when there is a certain attitude that only lives through a framework of thought and judging things a particular way, that often is mistaken to be, being overly analytical. Whereas, I feel that I'm very analytical, and yet I'm not caught in my head. So the mixing the two up and thinking that thinking is suffering is a problem. So the reason I bring thinking in is because the body has many faculties, and the intellect is one tool, faculty, gift, when it's used just for its discernment factor and functioning in daily life. And intuition is another faculty. So some people will say, I feel what to do next. And that feeling, so I would say that in each moment I do what I feel like doing. My final feeling is contributed to by thought that is sometimes very analytical. So that doesn't tell me what to do, it just gives me information about a circumstance and the possible consequences that might come about, the benefits, the pros and the cons and all that. So that's information that comes into the system. Then there is the faculty of intuition and emotion, all sorts of, depending on how you're made up, all of that information goes in, and then we finally, a feeling arises. A feeling is the end product that I don't dictate of all of these faculties that have come into the mix, been thrown into the mix, a whole lot of different information, let's say, and then finally, and all of this could happen very quickly, a feeling of what to do. And the final feeling might follow only the logic, it might follow only the intuition, it might follow a combination of the logic and the intuition. Right? And intuition is not infallible. This is one of the things that if we follow our intuition, then everything will be fine. To me, intuition is not at all infallible. You can have the intuition to turn right, and you turn right and you get lost. So it's not infallible. What I'm distinguishing here between intuition and feeling, what I say, I follow what I feel like, is a final feeling based on a whole lot of contributing factors, of which intuition is one. And I find that if I follow my feeling, I still don't necessarily get infallibility in terms of outcomes, but I know that I consistently live life from that place of feeling. Understanding the outcome is not in my control, and ultimately not a determining factor of my completeness. And so that's enough for me to live life consistently. If we live life inconsistently, making decisions from all sorts of different places, then it makes sense that we'll have an inconsistent feeling with life. So this intuition is part of the intelligence, let's say, of the body, but intelligence doesn't mean infallible.
But also, I guess I'm making the distinction that feeling and intuition are not necessarily the same thing. Like, I can have an intuition to do something, but my feeling actually wants to do something else. So I do the feeling versus the intuition.
Yeah, and it depends what, you can have feeling, which is different to the feeling I talk about, which is the final feeling. So that final feeling can be contributed by the working mind delivering data, pros and cons, and right? There can be a feeling in the body of being hungry, let's say, or tired. There could be a feeling of desire for something, and then there could be intuition. And so the final feeling is a mix, or what pops out of that complete mix. If we find ourselves following just one of those, then it is probably not, it's not a movement that is availing itself of the complete intelligence of the body.
And then in talking about pleasure and pain, we keep talking about how pain is not a personal attack, and that is I need to hear that over and over again, because it feels like it when it's happening sometimes in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But that would also mean that pleasure is also not personal.
Exactly. Yeah.
But this is more difficult actually to digest, because I think what often makes things so pleasurable is because they are personal. Meaning, to get specific, like if you're making love to someone, it's usually pleasurable because of the personal attachment or connection that you have with them. If it wasn't personal, then it wouldn't be so pleasurable from my perspective. If someone gives you a discount in a store, maybe you think, oh, they thought I was a nice person, or they said something like, you seem really nice, I want to give this to you. So again, pleasure is often associated with something that feels personal.
Mm-hmm.
So to say pain is not a personal attack, okay, fine. But to say pleasure is not a personal thing feels a bit also.
Yeah. So once again, we need to understand the distinctions, because there are a lot of distinctions. So pleasure and pain, on the one hand, are happening to me, right? That's why it's pleasurable, because it is happening it's being received by the person, right? What I mean by it's not personal is it's not a determining factor of who you are. So on a deeper level, it's not, if someone attacks you, it's happening to me, right, on one level. On another level, if certain beliefs are not in place, a story that this person disrespected me, so someone can have disrespected me, and I can discern that was disrespectful. But the story that says that's disrespectful and it's an attack on who I am at a level of self where I then hate them, that's different. So that's where it's not personal. So pleasure, if we take life personally, what happens is pain becomes much more uncomfortable than just the pain when it's not personal. So it's still received by the person, and it can be out of line with the person's biological preferences. So on one level, it's personal, right? And you're right that things that are pleasurable because it's happening to me. So where it's not personal is that those things are not an indication of your worth. And when we think they are, when someone does something painful, it's not only painful, but it's very bitter, because it's taken to be an attack on me at my core. And similarly, when someone does something pleasurable, if we have that belief, it's received in a very intensely, or there's a very strong, what you could say pleasure, but it's not just pleasure, it's pleasure plus this boost to the egoic structure.
This is why love attachments, though, I think become so strong, is
Yeah.
because it really does feel like someone's touching you at the deepest core of your being.
Yeah, which is, the thing is that what we tend to call love is absolutely not love, it's attachment, it's need. And that's why if it's love, when the other person does something that you don't like, there isn't this collapse of taking it personally. And when it's need and attachment, there absolutely is.
Okay, so you said something here, and I've been wanting to ask this for a while, not just here, but in general. And my notes are on my phone today. But so the heart, you said, we come back to the heart. We rest in our heart. And the heart is the impersonal source of life, the consciousness joining with our personal consciousness. It's like that junction of impersonal consciousness with personal consciousness. I've noticed that the majority of living spiritual teachers today, minus a few, are all in relationships. So there's this beautiful thing about we don't need another, and yet almost everyone who says this truth chooses to be with another.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that the ultimate, in quotes, love relationship or partnership is because when two people come together in that level of consciousness, they're both resting like in the heart together? So there's that divine connection of like the impersonal with the personal in that awareness. I mean, because there does seem like there's a possibility in connection with another being that is quite magnificent.
So let me put it a different way. You can reconcile it with what you've said, is that when they say there isn't a need for the other, what that means is that we've come to recognize our completeness, our own completeness, which is available for everyone if the certain obstructing constructs fall away. I am complete, and therefore the obsessive need for love has fallen away. And yet that means we love ourselves, in the sense that once there is the recognition that I am complete, there is no longer the not loving of oneself and the shame and the guilt and all of that. And then a complete person will still find themselves living life, will still have preferences, and will still find themselves with a destiny. And so it makes complete sense to me that that relationships will happen on top of the completeness, which really means that that person gets to walk their path, and if someone's walking next to them, that's fantastic. It means I'm walking my path and someone is walking next to me, holding hands. And as soon as you're not handcuffed, which is what tends to be when we need love, right? You hold hands and you snap the handcuffs on. And so then if destiny starts taking you in different directions, then you're holding hands and you can let go of the hands and remain complete in yourself, understanding that destiny is now separating these two people. So hopefully you can look back and feel the gift of the love while you were together. And that love actually might not end, even though you've gone in different directions, which is very different to when the handcuffs are on. When the handcuffs are on, you go in different directions, but you can't go in different directions because the handcuffs are on. And when the handcuffs finally break, because destiny is forcing you in different directions, which makes that breaking stage very uncomfortable, then there's resentment, there's hatred, and feeling insecure and unworthy. And so the love doesn't get to stay, probably because there wasn't love in the first place, there was just need and attachment. And so that's the difference.
if this is appropriate to ask. In lovemaking, sorry, Daniel. He's look at the time. Yeah, it's when you feel like you're merging with another person, not just physically, but I mean on many levels. Is that it feels like consciousness is merging. It feels like there's the possibility that you are experiencing a level of oneness in an extreme way that you don't necessarily experience at other times. Like, I guess I'm just trying to, I feel that there's a potential in intimate relationships to experience a reality of our human incarnation that I just feel like there's a possibility that is not often really talked about. And because we get so confused with our attachments and our needs and all of this, that this part often gets overlooked. And I don't know, if you don't feel like talking about it, I completely respect that, but I am curious.
I think it's clear that there's lots of different ways that we can touch this completeness. And Tantra uses intimacy and lovemaking and awareness as a methodology, because it does seem like that coming together can be a way of demonstrating a completeness. Now the question is it a completeness because my incompleteness has been completed by the other? Or is it a completeness that is recognized of what we really are in a situation where two people have come together? And so then that's where it can be confusing in a sense if we interpret it to be, I feel complete because the other has completed me. And so why is it that we can feel complete in those situations? It could be that our attention, our mind gets so, or not the mind, but we become so absorbed and involved in the activity, just like if you're painting, and the thinking mind falls away. And then there is just the activity. And this could be the case if we really feel like we're missing the love of the other. If that's delivered in a situation, and it's really felt that the other really is here for me in this situation, it can completely, in that moment, dissolve the sense that I'm not good enough, which might be a prevailing factor, let's say. And so in that moment, we feel complete, not because the other person has completed us, but because the thinking that normally covers up our completeness has subsided. And so that happens when we indulge in pleasure. In a lot of, that's why people go to pleasure, is because pleasure does temporarily create a thinking pattern that undoes the thinking pattern that says I'm not worthy. So simply getting pleasure can be interpreted on a subconscious level that life has delivered me pleasure, so I'm worthy. Just simply tasting chocolate, let's say, could, on an unconscious level, mean, I must be worthy because I've got pleasure. Life has delivered pleasure in this moment. You can see it's not really undoing the error. If anything, it's reinforcing the error by saying, I must be worthy because I have received something that confirms I'm worthy, rather than recognizing our innate worthiness. But that doesn't change the fact that what engaging in the pleasure or receiving the pleasure does is it temporarily cuts off the story that says something is missing.
This is so profound, because even though I've had great love for my last two relationships, I can see how both of them were actually just quieting my thinking mind. Mm-hmm. And that in itself was that in itself helped me touch my true nature.
Yeah.
But then the thinking mind returns. It's like, this is such a profound insight for me. Thank you.
Good. And so in that situation, where the attachment to love is still essentially there, and why you were feeling that is because it was being quietened, as soon as the other does something in the opposite direction, not delivering what you would like, or leaving or anything like that, then we probably find ourselves spiraling in the opposite direction of feeling, completely abandoned and incomplete. Thank you.